Thank you, Christian. Welcome to everyone. Magandang hapon po sa ating lahat. Well, of course, that's pretty much it. So, what I'm going to say. But in addition to that, I'd like to talk a bit about the Philippine Migration Research Network. It's actually a community of scholars, both here and abroad, who have a strong interest in doing migration research, whether this be about international migration or internal migration. We are fortunate enough to be adopted by the Philippine Social Science Council, which is in itself an association of Philippine Social Science Associations that's been around for quite a long time, and it is something that they do to have these kinds of events from time to time. The event today is actually a book launch, Philippine book launch for a book written by a scholar, Yasmin Ortiga, who is based at the Singapore Management University, and we're very grateful that she has allowed us to have this book launch for today. This is also part of the month of Overseas Filipinos celebration. I am not sure if you're all familiar with this series of celebrations that we have in preparation for or as part of the month of Overseas Filipinos, which is supposed to be in December. So we take this event as one of those activities, leading up to the month of Overseas Filipinos. Last but not the least, I encourage everyone to become a member of the Philippine Migration Research Network. If you have time, you can grab a membership form outside by the registration desk. You really have nothing to lose except your 500 pesos annual membership fee to the network, for which you will get some benefits in terms of your exposure to and exchanges with different migration scholars. So yun lamang po at maraming salamat.
So just on a personal note, when I started writing this book, I had to publish it in an international press to keep my job. Academics in the world, they know that. But for me, the ultimate success of this project would be to publish a book for Filipinos. And so this was the image I had in my head, and I felt like if I couldn't have a Philippine edition of the book, then I wouldn't have succeeded in what I wanted to do. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I worked for Singapore Management University, and when they found out I was coming, they said, I have to mention that SMU and UP has had a long history together as part of the ASEAN University Network. Let me read this kasi hihingi sila ng proof na ginawa ko talaga. So UP Diliman and SMU have been part of the same committee focused on technology-enhanced personalized learning networks, and apparently have worked very closely in improving pedagogy and learning experiences for all students in the ASEAN. Okay, that's done. My picture. Okay, good. No, but thank you, everyone. And a special thanks to Christian, TMRN, and UPPI. I know it takes a lot of time and effort to come here, to invite folks, and given the traffic, malapit na magpasko. So I'm just saying that, the gratitude is all of mine. So thank you for being here. Okay, so with any book, I know in any book launch, right? You're coming, you're trying to be supportive, or maybe your prof told you to come. Arnie Trinidad, shout out to you. But I am well aware that very few people in this room have actually read the book. So how do I condense these stories into a coherent presentation? I thought it might be best to start with just two. I'll start with Rachel. So when I first reached out to Rachel in June 2020, the 36-year-old nurse was isolating at home just outside the Philippine city of Cebu. 6 months before our interview, she had a job offer from a nursing home in Ireland, a long-awaited opportunity. It had taken 3 years to collect all the necessary paperwork for jobs in the UK. As soon as she got her offer, she resigned from her hospital job and devoted all her time to preparing for departure. When COVID-19 hit the Philippines and the country went on lockdown, she was just waiting for her work visa to be approved. Then the Philippine government announced that it would suspend the departures of all nurses bound for jobs abroad until the national state of emergency had passed. Rachel was stuck. The nurse manager at her former hospital called Rachel, begging her to come back. Staff nurses were falling sick, the wards were overwhelmed. Would she be willing to take on a few shifts? Rachel said no. It's not as if I intended to leave my colleagues to deal with the virus. I know that's what it looks like, she said. Alam ko yan ang iniisip mo. But nurses should not be forced to work, even within their own country. Larry, a 31-year-old bartender, was also feeling anxious. He began 2020 as he had always done for the last 9 years, manning the largest bar of an international cruise ship. It was peak season and the ship was packed with tourists. Suddenly, in March 2020, a mysterious virus began to spread in other ships. The captain of Larry's ship was told to disembark all passengers at the nearest port and cancel all voyages. But Larry claimed he was never really scared of the virus. He was more worried about what to do once he arrived home. If my wife and I don't do something fast, we'll end up grinding salt to feed our kids. Magdidikdik na kami ng asin. The first time we spoke, Larry was just bracing himself for a few more months of unemployment, hoping he could find a part-time job while global travel was at a standstill. Neither of us had known that it would take another 2 years before the cruise industry would fully resume operations. How do we make sense of Rachel and Larry's stories? There is a lot written about people like them, workers whose care and service labor have become integral to the global economy. However, often there is a tendency to depict them as immigrants outside the Philippines. Even during the pandemic, all the news was about Filipino nurses dying in American hospitals or cruise workers stuck at sea. Little was said about nurses like Rachel who were unable to emigrate, or cruise workers like Larry who were sent back to their countries of origin. It was assumed that because these workers were at home, their struggles had either ended or were yet to begin. How do we make sense of a government like the Philippines? If you look at the scholarship, the source nation is barely present. When people refer to the migration state, they are really talking about destination countries, where the big issues are about controlling the influx of immigrants. Meanwhile, the few studies in the Philippines have mostly painted a picture of a giant labor exporting machine, where Filipinos are commodified and deployed to overseas employers in order to maximize the monetary remittances they will eventually send home. The image is compelling, but as a Filipino, it always felt incomplete. Inisip ko, wow, napaka-efficient naman ng gobyerno na to. Gobyerno ko pala yun. Sa Philippine state. So, in this book, I tried to tell a different story. I argue that migration governance is not only about regulating movement. Rather, it is also about defining the meaning and implications of remaining in place. While researchers have tended to focus on migrants themselves, a sending state must also engage with those who have yet to leave, those unable to do so, and a vast majority who have no intention of leaving at all. The pandemic pushed this process into the spotlight when suddenly the Philippine state had to deal with two groups of immobile workers. Nurses like Rachel, prevented from leaving the country to aid in the nation's COVID-19 response, and cruise workers like Larry, who lost their jobs overseas. So how do sending states manage their immobile citizens? A big part of this is about controlling the narrative about those who are unable to move. Narinig na natin yung ibang kwento, di ba? Yung bagong bayani, those are about people who move. But what about those who don't move? Scholars have long shown how states maintain political legitimacy through public narratives. As a sociologist, I examined how nurses, cruise workers, and state officials competed to convey a story that could gain the most sympathy, commiseration, and support from the Filipino public. For the cruise workers, Philippine government officials tried to frame the pandemic as a time to start anew, to settle down and build an alternative livelihood at home. State agencies poured millions of pesos into promoting entrepreneurship and reintegration programs for forced returnees. However, cruise workers found themselves treated as low-skilled labor, with little use beyond the hotels and restaurants where they used to work. So rather than permanent resettlement, cruise workers saw their immobility as an extended period of treading water, during which they were simply working to stay afloat. In other words, the story didn't really stick. For nurses, Philippine officials argued that they were simply placing the country's health needs first, even if it came at the cost of its labor export programs. The narrative was that nurses' immobility was only temporary, pansamantala lang to, an emergency measure to prevent the loss of essential skill. This time, the state's story was successful, and the Filipino public supported the ban, even in its most restrictive form. While immobile nurses and their allies successfully pressured state officials to loosen the conditions of the deployment ban, they failed to achieve their main goal, the free departure of all Filipino healthcare workers bound for jobs abroad. 2 years after the last COVID-19 regulations were removed in 2023, the Philippine state continued to enforce a cap of deploying only 7,500 nurses per year, far below the 22,000 nurses deployed in 2019. I've heard that they recently removed the cap altogether, but it stayed for quite a long time, given that restrictions had been lifted much earlier. Why were the outcomes so different for nurses and cruise workers? One story just failed to stick with the Filipino public, while the other was replicated and reinforced and reinvigorated in many ways. I argue that any public narrative requires a subject that drives the plot forward, justifying the story to a broader audience. In this book, the notion of skill was the pivot point that determined how workers' immobilities were defined. For nurses, the health crisis made it easy to justify their skills as a scarce resource, conveniently ignoring how the state had actively exported nurses' labor before the pandemic. In fact, we were known as the largest source of migrant nurse labor in the world. In contrast, the service skills of cruise workers, already devalued within the Philippines, had become even more dispensable in the context of the crisis. As a result, any narrative on their successful reintegration failed to gain ground. You might ask, why does this matter? So what? Well, there are high stakes in telling the right story of immobility, one that provides a compelling rationale of who deserves to move and who can be forced to stay. And in the end, the immobility narrative that prevailed determined how immobile workers were treated by others in their communities, by us, right, the people around them, and how their government was expected to respond to their needs. During the pandemic, cruise workers received nationwide sympathy and eventually state assistance to hasten their departure. But migrant nurses were castigated by the general public. Bakit atat na atat kayo umalis? and left with only a grudging compromise from the state. My last interview with Larry was towards the end of 2021. The former bartender was offered a chance to return to his ship a few months before, but in the end, he decided to remain at home. Unlike many of his former colleagues, Larry was lucky to find a new career working from home as a call center agent. In many ways, he had accomplished what the Philippine state had wanted all returning migrants to do, find a place for themselves at home and start anew. But as government officials pivoted back to deploying cruise workers, his achievement didn't really seem to generate much public praise. And even Larry himself did not see his career as a success. I know it's cheesy, but I feel like I went through a heartbreak. Parang na-heartbroken din ako, ma'am. And I just feel I need to move on. Cruise work was my life for 10 years. When I think about it, I feel emotional. It is the reason I was able to build the dreams I have right now. Having graduated with only a 2-year associate's degree, Larry would need to invest in obtaining a bachelor's degree, 4 years, in order to qualify as head bartender for Manila's 5-star hotels. Why? We don't know. The lack of recognition for returning migrant skills has long frustrated reintegration efforts in the Philippines. Yet, in a post-pandemic economy, such challenges were no longer the state's main priority. Rachel, the aspiring migrant nurse, was also heartbroken, but for completely different reasons. When I called her for our last interview, I assumed she had already left for abroad. I was shocked when she told me that she failed to leave. While the Philippine state loosened the deployment ban in mid-2020, the recruitment agency processing her papers went out of business, further delaying her departure for Ireland. Unwilling to wait, her supposed employer withdrew their offer and canceled her contract. Making things worse, the rest of Rachel's documents for overseas work expired one by one. Her certificate of sponsorship, her IELTS results, her medical exam, and her endorsement letter from the Irish Nursing and Midwifery Board. From being at the cusp of departure, Rachel was back to zero in a span of a few months. Still, stories like Rachel's did not generate much concern or attention back home. I'm sorry, I meant to say here, at home. Instead, the focus was on the plight of nurses who continued to work in Philippine hospitals, the real heroes. But while the state successfully disrupted Rachel's migration plans, it failed to channel Rachel towards the local hospitals that needed her labor. Instead, she got a job as a call center agent for Shearwater Health, a company that services American hospitals. The call center job still paid a salary higher than what local hospitals offered. And for Rachel, her clinical career in the Philippines had ended with her migration dreams to Ireland. 200,000 pesos down the drain, but we'll stay positive, ma'am. I keep thinking, maybe God has a plan. Sana, Ma'am Yasmin, pag nag-usap tayo ulit, sana mas happy na ang kwento ko sa'yo. Where do we go from here? The Philippines has often been viewed as a model for migration management, a blueprint for other source countries to emulate in the future. But as the experiences of nurses and cruise workers show, individual migrants take on the labor of readjusting their plans for departure and coping with the repercussions of disruptions like the pandemic. And in the end, while states try to manage immobility, workers like Rachel and Larry bear the consequences of being stuck at home. Thank you so much, everyone. It's made up of Karen Liao, who was a PhD student in geography in 2020. She was doing her dissertation on repatriation, and I convinced her to do this with me on the side, which, by the way, is the worst advice you can give to any student, so do not do that. But I think kami ni Karen, we were at this point where we just really wanted to do it. And then Michael Dino is a clinical instructor at Our Lady of Fatima University. He was supposed to be leaving for a PhD in Johns Hopkins University, a PhD in nursing. And his expertise is telehealth and technology for aging patients. Nothing to do with this project, but for some reason, he agreed to help me out. He was one of the first people who joined the project. And lastly, this is for all the students. Luis Macapasag is, he was a research assistant at the National Telehealth Center. Sorry. Yeah, so Luis is a nurse. He had gotten a bachelor's degree in nursing. Hindi na siya nakaalis kasi bumagsak na yung demand by the time he graduated. So he was working as a research assistant in UP-PGH. I don't think people know that when the pandemic was at its worst, they had required everyone with a nursing degree to provide support in the wards. So imagine, I don't know if the students can relate, research assistant ka lang nag-excel, tapos bigla na lang, oh, may nursing degree ka, o pumunta ka sa wards to help out. Because I think their first batch of health workers had fallen sick too quickly, so kailangan nila ng support. And I remember I told Luis na, not worth your life, right? Don't do it. Basically, I told him, don't do this kasi your research assistant job is just a job order position. Walang magko-cover ng health insurance mo kung may mangyari sa'yo. But Luis insisted on helping out. And because of him, we were able to interview nurses who were actually working in the COVID-19 wards during the pandemic. And I thought that was really commendable. So, and then lastly, oh my gosh, this is the best. When I was writing the book, I needed a copy editor who understood the Philippine context. At nandito si Lynn Lopez, who is a copy editor. And basically, all Lynn had to do was correct my grammar and check for typos and clarity. But I remember that she read the entire book and then sent me an email to say something like, good job, Yas, or gets ko yung story mo. Tapos super talaga ako umiyak kasi parang, Lynn, it's not your job to read the story, but you cared enough about it. And she put a lot of effort and labor into making sure the book story was clear, and I'm very grateful for that. So this is all to say for our students, in an age of AI, I think perhaps in the future, you don't even need people to do this sort of work. But I think there was a real joy in working with people who didn't have to care about the project, but did. And people who didn't have to do the project, but did. And so I just wanted to recognize that. Thank you so much.
Is something that is accessible to most people. I had the honor to write the foreword of the Philippine edition, and that afforded me the opportunity to be among the first readers. And it was a most rewarding and delightful experience. This book is based on solid scholarship, theoretically and methodologically sound. And promise, pag nabasa nyo, hindi talaga siya nosebleed. And I think I also want to give credit to Yasmin's copy editor for doing also a great job of making this really very readable. Readable na academic siya, pero hindi naman dumbed-down version. Okay, so but I also feel that Yasmin herself is a very good writer, and as you have seen earlier, as you have heard earlier, she is a very compelling storyteller, and that's what her book also sounds like. No, may kwento may kwento siya, and she's, I think, able to capture the academic, the policy dilemmas, but also the personal frustrations of the people who have been deeply impacted by the pandemic. So nandun yung empathy, but then also you know at the very same time that it's not something that's just an emotional pull, but it's something that's based on methodology. And before I also delve into some of the themes of the book, I'd also just like to mention that one of the things that I actually enjoyed reading in this book is the methodology chapter. No? Kasi it was done at a time that is so unusual. Diba? Lahat tayo we were all rendered immobile. But then at the same time, there was also, of course, the online platforms that made a lot of things possible. But I think in this book, Yasmin also provided a lot of reflections on the possibilities as well as limitations of online platforms and their uses in social science research. So when the pandemic struck, our world stood still. We were forcibly immobilized, which was a shock to our psyche and system, which had become accustomed to a world in motion and a world of hypermobility. Particularly for the Philippines, we had gotten accustomed to our kababayans coming and going. The pandemic brought a radical halt to this pattern and rendered immobile the Philippines as an emigration state, and Filipinos who had long been part of the global workforce. And I think that one of the contributions of this book is really to highlight the fact that even as the Philippines is an emigration state, it is not always just facilitating migration, as a lot of the scholarship on the Philippine state would frame it, but that as an emigration state, particularly during this unusual period in human history, the Philippines also had to exercise certain measures that would regulate the out movement of people and actually restrict the out movement of people. So as she had explained, the book examines the impact of the pandemic on the Philippine state, which was confronted with immense governance challenges of repatriating OFWs back home, and with some 2 million Filipinos who returned home unexpectedly, the formidable challenge of reintegrating them in an economy that was hit hard by a long and hard lockdown and grim economic prospects. And then at another level, the pandemic impacted different populations of OFWs whose hopes for continued or better prospects were dashed. Vacationing OFWs who got stranded in the Philippines, those on the verge of leaving, such as Rachel, but got caught in restrictions in the Philippines and also overseas as well, and those who were working abroad who lost their jobs and were repatriated. So the book compares two groups of OFWs, nurses and cruise ship workers, and how the Philippine state dealt with them during the pandemic, and the contrasts are pretty dramatic. So the case of nurses, I think, would probably be a unique case. Nurses were much in demand abroad, but were held back by the state, citing the health crisis and the national interest. Initially, there was a ban on the departure of healthcare workers and professionals, but due to protests and advocacy by nurses' associations, the Department of Migrant Workers backtracked and imposed a cap on the number who could be allowed to leave the country. Initially, it was about 5,000 and was increased over time until the 7,000 cap was reached in 2022. Hindi pa nga klaro kung talagang wala na yung cap, no? Because I actually inquired from the DMW, and the response was the Department of Health wants the cap to remain. But the Department of Migrant Workers, it seems wala talagang masyadong clarity as to whether the cap can be lifted or not. I think in my last conversation with one of the officials, they mentioned that the cap remains because the IATF hasn't lifted it, but then the IATF is no longer operational, so I don't know what it means. But nonetheless, if you look at the statistics, I think 2023 or 2024, there were just about 8,000 nurses who left the country. And I think that's a pretty low number, because if we consider the demand for nurses, it's just increasing, no? Especially in the case of European countries. And so if there were only about more than 8,000 who left in 2023 or 2024, that means that there are a lot more who have still been rendered immobile for certain reasons. Okay, so ano ba yung cap na yun? No? Kasi nagkaroon talaga ng debate in the case of the nurses, which we don't find for other workers, which we don't find for the cruise ship workers, and for many other OFWs for that matter. Talagang sa nurse lang nagkaroon ng cap. And the reason for that was, of course, because it was a health emergency, it was a health crisis, and in the national interest. And if we look at our constitution, indeed the Philippine Constitution provides the freedom of movement, but that freedom is not also absolute, and that the state can actually exercise judgment on when the movement can be restricted on the basis of public health, public interest, and national interest. But there were also, and I think in this regard, this is one of the things that's often not appreciated also by other scholars, and I'm glad that actually Yasmin took it up in this book, that the state from time to time does exercise restrictions on emigration, especially in cases of war and conflict overseas, as well as in instances when there are many reports of violations of migrants' protection. And what is also interesting is that despite the fact that the state might be doing this for the purpose of protecting migrant workers themselves are the ones who would protest against such a state action. So I think because of our long history of sustained and large-scale migration, talagang nagkakaroon na ng tension between what is the national interest, what is protection according to the definition of the state, and what is protection and what is also interest at the level of individual migrants. So, meron din mga instances noon na may tinatawag nun sa POEA na mission critical skills. Okay? So, usually for certain skills for which there are very few Filipinos who are qualified to perform certain types of jobs, usually, di ba, pag nag-resign sa isang trabaho, you only need to provide 1 month's notice. Pero ang ginawa nun ng POEA for so-called mission critical skills, you need to give an advance notice of at least 6 months. But this one was not, of course, enforced in the case of nurses. It was banned, and then relaxing it and having a cap instead. So, yun lang, yung kanina din, dun sa nabanggit ni Yasmin, no? What could have the Philippines done during the pandemic with respect to the nurses? Naisip ko lang na, halimbawa, if the Philippines did not have any restrictions at all, then it would be heyday on the part of other scholars who have been calling the Philippine state as a labor broker state. Okay? But maybe the issue is not so much whether the Philippine state is a labor broker state or not, but that, you know, it has, at this point in time, it really has to navigate a much more complicated terrain than it did in the 1970s when labor migration was relatively new. Yun lang yung naisip ko na question, no? Na halimbawa, if the Philippines did not impose any cap at all, what would we have thought? I mean, people here in the Philippines, academics and Filipinos in general, ano kayang iisipin natin kung pinabayaan ng gobyerno na sige umalis yung mga nurses? Okay. So, I think that's one question to ask. And then, in the case of the cruise ship workers, so I guess the cruise ship workers are the other seafarers. Unfortunately, during the time of the pandemic, di ba, nagkaroon tayo ng parang appreciation about migrant workers who are essential workers. But then also, parang meron din isang level na there are certain migrant workers who are not necessarily essential workers. Parang hindi rin tama yung parang ganong thinking, no, at the time. But unlike the traditional seafarers, that is those working on merchant vessels, who were also counted among essential workers during the pandemic, sea-based workers employed in cruise ships were among the first workers who were laid off and were among the first arrivals of repatriated workers to the Philippines. Sa palagay ko, yung kaso ng mga cruise ship workers, they may actually extend to other types of workers who return to the Philippines unexpectedly. If there was one bright spot during the pandemic, siguro yun yung nagkaroon ng panahon, there was much thought that was given to reintegration, particularly the notion of sustainable reintegration. There were some fruitful initiatives that came out, such as, among others, the National Action Plan on Sustainable and Gender-Responsive Return and Reintegration, and the strengthening of the National Reintegration Center for OFWs, which was eventually merged in the Department of Migrant Workers when it came to be in 2022. Tapos nauso din noon yung tinatawag na whole of society approach to support sustainable reintegration. But even before the pandemic ended, as documented also in our research, many already had plans of returning to work abroad as soon as the opportunity arises. Interestingly, the discussions in the Philippines on sustainable reintegration recognizes remigration as part of several pathways OFWs might opt for. So this was really, I think, a very clear departure from the traditional notion before that when we spoke of reintegration programs in the Philippines, there's this notion that the OFWs are returning home for good. Hindi talaga nangyayari yun. Because even the data of the POEA before had regularly documented that OFWs tend to renew their contract for as long as they can and as possibly as they can. So that if we look at the statistics in the Philippines between new hires and rehires, actually every year, kung titingnan natin yung statistics ng deployed overseas Filipino workers, mas malaki yung proportion ng rehires compared to the new hires, indicating, the tendency to renew the contract as possibly as they can. So, malaking bagay yun na na-recognize na hindi kinakailangan na for good. And that if remigration, if going to work abroad again, was also part of the strategies of OFWs and their households. So that was also taken as part of the strategies that they have so that they can build towards a sustainable return at some point. But even then, there's also now the recognition that when OFWs leave, even if we are operating under a regime of temporary labor migration, hindi ibig sabihin na yung movement is from the Philippines to destination A, and from destination A coming back to the Philippines. It's possible that from destination A, OFWs might actually consider going to destination B or C. Okay? So, hindi kinakailangan na bumalik dito sa atin. As in previous crisis, the go-to option is self-employment. So it was nothing new that people were encouraged to go into self-employment. And perhaps it was not really only for OFWs, actually for Filipinos in general. Because at that time, ano nga ba talaga yung pwedeng magawa natin? No? So, maraming mga home businesses that flourished during the pandemic. But, as soon as the pandemic also got under control, parang back to business or back to the usual business din. I think there are so many gems that really can learn from Yasmin's book, but I think also what the book also raises are more questions. What happens now after the pandemic? So again, we return to the case of the nurses. Kasi siguro yung sa nurses, maybe it's really a special case. Particularly when we consider the fact and the prospect that there will be increasing demand for nurses and other healthcare workers. And where do we stand, no? In that particular prospect? What are our options really in terms of policies and also in terms of how we will also address our own healthcare needs in the future? And perhaps maybe instead of maybe providing some answers, maybe I'll also just leave you with one question. One question that has also haunted me when I was reading and rereading Yasmin's book is how do we imagine a Philippines without immigration? What would that look like? And what would that require for our policymakers? And what would that require for various stakeholders to imagine a sustainable Philippines without migration? Thank you, Yasmin.
Magandang hapon sa bawat isa, and I'm really grateful to be part of this book launch. Maraming salamat, Yasmin, for the gift of your storytelling and the gift of your book. So I wrote down a few points, and I'm going to read them to keep to the time, although there are so many things to say about the book, just like Ma'am Marla said. So I'll start. In her book, Yasmin highlighted how Mr. Casco, a former bureaucrat, described migration governance as a dance. I'll use the same metaphor to describe my experience in reading her book. It was a dance. The experience was both beautiful and poignant at the same time. I danced to a variety of emotions, unfortunately not all of which were happy. I was conflicted and was very surprised to hear myself blurt out, "Ang kakapal ng mga mukha niyo." When I got to the discussion on the deployment ban on nurses during the pandemic, specifically when the Duterte administration was holding outbound nurses hostage emotionally to pressure them to serve the country, when they themselves pocketed millions of pesos during that time. Okay, those who know me would say that this really was uncharacteristic of me, you know, very quiet and very calm. And then to hear myself say that out loud, I felt that I realized I was really angry. I had to put the book down. I didn't touch it for a few days to relax. So it is precisely this kind of tunay yun. Tunay po, hindi ko siya mahawakan ulit. Sabi ko baka mag-react. Magwala ako. But it is precisely that kind of visceral reaction that highlights Yasmin's brilliance as a storyteller, to echo what Marla said earlier. She takes her readers right to the heart of the stories she tells. She does not take the spotlight, but allows us to understand the experiences of the research participants through their own voices. And I'd like to highlight a few important points that were underlined in the book. The concept of immobility, the valuation of skills, and the focus on the home or sending country. So I'll start with the idea of immobility. One of my earliest understandings of migration is that we cannot talk about the mobile without talking about the immobile. Among transnational families, for example, a migrant's mobility is anchored to the necessary immobility of another family member to ensure the collective's survival. So one member is able to emigrate because there will be someone else to take care of familiar responsibilities, especially those that center on caring for the left behind family members. So si ate pwedeng umalis, si kuya pwedeng umalis kasi si bunso alagaan si nanay, may iwan para mag-alaga sa bahay or sa pamilya. So nakakaalis yung iba. So this practice is undergirded by the ideas of familyhood, love, and sacrifice that are often taken as given. But we should in fact problematize because these are not always willing or happy. Very often those who stay, or in the words of Yasmin, immobilized, resent being tied to a place and to familial responsibilities and unable to realize their own migration aspirations. The book's discussion of immobility to me is this, but manifested at another scale, where the state acts paternalistically and decides who gets to move and who gets immobilized. Crucially, the state's action here mirrors and magnifies the sacrificial logic of familial immobility, extending the sense of familyhood to the borders of the nation-state, and appealing to the sense of nationalism, heroism, and sacrifice, all for the preservation, if not survival, of the collective. As a geographer, I find it also interesting to see how immobility is produced, but also very often resisted through the interactions of actors located at different scales and spaces. So on the valuation of skills. In the book, Yasmin argues that the notion of skill is like what she said earlier, the pivot point that determines how workers' immobilities are defined. So specifically, the skills of nurses were deemed essential during the pandemic, whereas those of cruise workers were deemed unnecessary, resulting in different responses from the government, industries, and communities. And interestingly, I just remember, may isang malaking office, I think somewhere along Hill Puyat, may malaki right after the pandemic when we opened a bit, may malaki silang poster na nakalagay, cruise workers, seafarers are also essential. I think in response to how the government imagined them to be. So such differential valuation of skills at various intersections of time and space is something we need to understand further because it produces a hierarchy of skills and jobs that consequently leads to the ranking of people and the production of multiple forms of othering. The participants in the study appear to have a positive sense of self. that is tied to the work that they do, and therefore to the skills they possess. When undervalued, such as when cruise workers don't get accepted in call centers because of their, in quotes, lack of communication skills. In the book, Yasmin said, probably just because of the accent. No? There is an accepted form of accent in that industry. Or when nurses are not given the respect and the salary they deserve, I wonder how these reshape their senses of self, their sense of place, their sense of belonging in their migration aspirations. This intersection of differential skill valuation and shattered self-regard is a crucial avenue for future research into the lived costs of precarious labor regimes. And finally, the focus on the home and sending country. So the book contributes significantly to migration scholarship with its focus on the home or sending country. A colleague, Jere Opiniana, and I have lamented the still very skewed focus on the host countries in discussions on migration, whether in conferences or in publications. We need to understand what is going on in a home country, because not everyone can leave. Not everyone who wants to leave can leave, for various reasons at different scales. So Yasmin's book tells the stories of trapped professionals, in this case Filipino nurses who were unable to emigrate during the pandemic because the state prevented them from leaving the country, and cruise workers who were similarly held immobile but on different grounds. We would never have understood why, and probably would have understood how certain would-be migrants could not realize their migrant aspirations. Without this focus, the focus on the sending state, we risk treating migration as a unilateral phenomenon, ignoring the profound and complex ways state policy and local governance shape the very possibility of mobilities. So focusing on the sending country does not invalidate the importance of focusing on the host country. However, it provides us with clarity on the migration journeys of migrants. It enables us to see the broader picture of migration, including the interactions between migration aspirations, migration governance, and the mobile and immobile populations in the context of the home, thereby enriching our understanding of migrant lives and experiences. So when I started reading Yasmin's book, I thought it was only my mind that would be fed. As I danced my way through the manuscript, however, I realized it not only nourishes the intellect, it's a very readable book. I could have read it in one sitting because it's very kind and very readable. But again, I did not because of repercussions to my mental health. So her book was food for the soul. Yasmin, through her book, engages our minds and hearts. She challenges our values and our capacity to feel as scholars and as Filipinos. I do not know whether that was part of her intention in writing the book, but it had that effect on me. The conflicted feeling I felt as I read her book, what I earlier said, was for me a gift, an invitation, and a reminder of why we do what we do. Our work as scholars must therefore be twofold: to identify social concerns and recommend solutions, and perhaps more importantly, to amplify the voices of those who are often unheard, and to provide crucial platforms for the underrepresented to be seen. Maraming salamat.
Thank you both for these very important comments. Just to share, we launched the international edition of the book in Singapore, and it's just different. Of course, that was wonderful and celebratory, and all my academic friends asked questions, but I think it's different when it comes from people who had gone through it. I mean, I didn't even go through it. Nasa Singapore kami, 2 months lang yung lockdown namin. So I just can't imagine what it's like for people who have gone through the full experience. Yeah. So, no, but maybe we can open up for questions. How would you like it to tinitingnan ko si Christian as master of ceremonies?
If you'd like first to respond to any of their points, and then we can open it for questions or...
Yeah, okay, yeah, Christian's in teacher mode. He's like, say something substantial. No, I'll respond to 2 things. First, I would like to share that one of the things that really rattled me in writing the book is nag-disagree kami ni Ma'am Marla. So I really look up to Ma'am Marla as like the pioneers of migration studies. And at first, like the whole story in my head is, as Banji say, ang kakapal na mukha nyo. it is a state that's oppressing its nurses, or after devaluing them for years, suddenly to immobilize them. And I think si Ma'am Marla was the one who asked, but are we just going to let them go? Sometimes what about people left behind? And sometimes it's not just a migration policy, Yasmin, it's a national policy or it's a health policy. And I think that really, at first I was a little angry at Ma'am Marla, but then no one can ever respond. But I think Ma'am Marla has a very balanced view of the challenges faced. And actually see Sir Rick Casco, who is a retired POEA official, we also really disagreed with each other and were debating points on Facebook. And then I only found out later on na si Sir Rick nagka-COVID, one of the very early patients, and he had been put in ICU. And parang bigla ko naisip, ang kapal na mukha ko, right, to be lecturing Sir Rick about letting nurses go when he himself had depended so much on the nurses in the hospital. So that was important. Right? That's what I like to say. Actually, guys, in academia, it's more fun when people agree with you all the time. But actually, I think the best word comes from disagreement, especially from people who really admire. So I think that's great. And I think Banji really points out a really important point about the family. Medyo nagkulang siya. So our data is based on in-depth interviews with nurses and cruise workers, but it was all online. It was 200 interviews, all conducted via Facebook Messenger, because hindi kaya ng internet natin ang Zoom. Parang masyado naghahang. So we recruit people on Facebook, we interview people on Facebook, I talk to my collaborators on Facebook. So I often said Facebook was my research management software. But yeah, it's because of that, some of our respondents, hindi ko alam kung ano yung itsura nila. I have very limited view into their actual family life, and I always wondered about that. And I'm so glad, I think Banji's work on family and migration is the missing point of this story. So I always wondered how does the family feel about it, and how does that shape everything else going on in their lives. So, no, but thank you so much. Thanks so much, Christian, for prompting me to say this.
Thanks, Yasmin. All right, so we have maybe a few minutes to open the floor for any questions or comments, or anyone would like to share anything, or questions for Yasmin. Go for you. Hi, yes, please. There's a microphone over there. And kindly introduce yourself.
Good afternoon po. Ako si Kurt, isang anthropologista. Magandang hapon po. Unang-una nagpapasalamat ako na meron that there is a local publication, because I kind of asked Marvin the other day how much the book was, because I was budgeting in my mind. How much will I not eat for the month to buy this book? And I was like, oh my god, I think it's not $200 US. So it's like how much my professor's books were when I was studying for masters. Thank you also for the research. I come from a village that has a lot of migrants. My cousins and aunties have also gone abroad. But one thing that stood out for me, I haven't read the book because I haven't purchased this, but one thing that stood out for me when you were talking about your book was the expiration of papers. So I was kind of like, how do we deal with that fact? It seems to me that it's not just the pandemic that kept the people from leaving, but it was also kind of like the tyranny of papers. It's almost tyrannical, especially because they're very arbitrary. Like I've taken IELTS twice, and I have to take it a third time to study for my PhD, and I'm kind of like, why do my English hasn't changed for the past 10 years? And I keep like, it keeps getting more expensive. When I started taking IELTS, it was 10,000, and now it's 13,000. And it seems like migrants are always at the mercy of these arbitrary papers. Thank you.
No, that's completely right. Thank you for it. It really is the tyranny, as you said, of paperwork nursing is one of the most highly regulated professions in the world. So yung requirements para maka-abroad is really very high, right? You have to get recognized to practice. You need to show work experience in a hospital with more than 100 beds. So definitely that was part of the problem. And in our discussion, sabi ni Ma'am Marla, Yasmin, don't let the receiving countries off the hook. Diba? Kasi bakit hindi sila nag-relax ng requirements? Is it really just the Philippine state's fault? And I agree completely. But I guess the stance that I took is that other scholars have already made that critique. And the missing link was what was going on back home. So definitely, yes, your IELTS for interested students will expire in 2 years, regardless of whether you can still speak English or not. Yeah, that will expire. Tapos yung certificate of sponsorship sa UK will expire in, I don't know, a month or something. But you have to receive it right before you apply for your work visa. So all of these things came into play. I have to say, looking meron bang mga state officials dito, all those problems were so invisible to state officials. They really had this image na parang, oh, wag muna ako mag-migrate, magtrabaho muna ako para sa bayan, and then maybe in 6 months, I'll just restart my journey. So yung mga nurse, yung mga nagsasabi na parang mag-expire na lahat ng papeles ko. And when one expires, the rest expire along with it. So it was just not in people's heads. Inassume nila madali lang para sa mga nurses. And I guess that's what we're trying to change now. No, but thanks for that question.
Alright, maraming salamat. Should we go a couple more, 1 or 2 more questions?
And please introduce yourself.
Hi po, Professor. Ako po si Enzo from the Pasig City Government. I'm currently taking up MA in Demography po during BPI. Kasi recently po I helped si Professor Jean Franco on a research on migrant nurses. Actually, I was skimming her book notes, really well written. I agree po with our resource persons. And I'm trying to detect po yung traces ng stories of nurses because we were also able to talk to some of them. I like po your focus dun po sa narrative ng government kasi they were really insisting na yung nurses, they stay here in the country. Yung nationalism, talagang ini-exploit po nila. But I also like po yung sa the last part of your book, your conversation with Mr. Casco, and how it actually made you realize some things. So it's really important. Of course, we can feel strongly about certain things. I relate po kay Ma'am Evangeline on that. Minsan ibabasa rin po kung bulastugan online, talagang grabe yung galit ko. But you really have to temper yourself as well. Ang question ko po, ma'am, ano po ba yung na-detect niyo po? Diba we have the state narrative? How did the nurses resist it? Exactly. How did they overcome it? Kasi they were able to at least nudge the government.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And so demography is the best masters that I'm looking at Elma. Yay! We need more demographers and demographers. Yeah, no, so this was why the state narrative was so successful. It's because the nurses' narrative wasn't united. So the nurses were split. There was a group, the most prominent was, they call themselves the prison nurses. So ang narrative nila ay forced immobility. Na parang immobilizing us is just like putting us into forced servitude. You're forcing us to work against our will. But then, there were also a lot of nurses who willingly entered the state's urgent hiring scheme. In fact, thanks to Luis, we were able to interview people who had entered the COVID wards nung libre pa siya. I don't know if people remember, there was a time na, call for volunteers! Tapos parang nagalit yung mga tao, so naging, oh sige, 500 pesos a day. Tapos nagalit na naman yung mga tao, tapos naging, oh sige, babayaran na namin kayo ng tamang sweldo, pero 3-month contract lang. So, dun pa lang sa libre, pumasok na sila, and the state kind of, it became a convenient group to refer to say, oh, bakit kayo atat na atat umalis? May mga nagserbisyo para sa bayan, diba? So they were split. But when we actually talked to the nurses who served in the COVID-19 wards, we found that actually the only reason they entered is kailangan nila ng hospital experience para makapag-abroad. So yung kwento sa akin ng mga nurses na pumasok is pipila daw sila sa HR ng Long Center. Yung harap nila nagtrabaho sa bangko ng 5 years. Yung sa likod nila nagtatrabaho sa kumpanya. Yung isa teacher, yung isa call center. Basically, lahat sila walang experience. So can you imagine to be, may lisensya ka, nakuha mo noong 2007, walang trabaho, so nag-ibang career ka na lang, biglang nagbukas na yung hospital para sa lahat, opportunity na magka-clinical experience. So when I say in the book, if the state had this narrative of emergency measure, the nurses had this narrative of windows of opportunity. But for the prison nurses, it was a window that was closing, while for the nurses who entered the hospitals, it was a window that was opening. Pero ang warning ko, at least to readers, is that this is a window that faces outwards. No one's going to stay in the end. That's an important question. Thank you. Salamat, Enzo.
Alright, maraming salamat. Perhaps if you have other questions later on, you could talk to Dr. Ortiga or to discussants. But for now, maraming salamat ulit for Dr. Ortiga for sharing your work. Excellent book. Congratulations.